For those who seek adventure, this is the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, sharing the people, places, and moments that make a life on the loose worth living.
The thing that's going to stick out to you most is when they open up that plane door. The cold is something like you've never felt.
The jungle's so thick, even if you had a machete, you couldn't get through it.
There's a huge blonde grizzly bear. And when it saw us, this thing put its head down, stomped on the ground, and hissed like an alligator.
I just crossed this brutal stretch of desert, and I was really suffering.
I'm your host, Will Collins. I'm an adventurer, outdoorsman, and roamer of wild places. I've backpacked the Brooks Range, rafted the Grand Canyon, and have canoed from source to sea, both the Mississippi and Yukon rivers. I live for adventure, travel, fresh air, and diving into the unknown. And now, I hope to share my passion with you on the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Episode number 6 of the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Boom, we are live. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. It's been a lot of fun. 1 week officially out, released to the public for the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, and we're crushing it. Already debuted in the top 40 of the Apple Podcast charts for the wilderness category. There's a bunch of heavy hitters in that top 40 chart. We broke that list on our opening day. So thank you so much for tuning in and downloading, checking it out, sharing the episodes and the show, telling friends about it. That's probably the best way. Hey, check it out. I got a cool podcast that you might want to listen to as you're heading out for your weekend adventure or at work or whatever it may be. And then the next thing, just a couple housekeeping notes before we get to the episode here is subscribe. Please, if you subscribe to this podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or on my website, buffaloroamer.com/podcast. You can subscribe in all those places, and if you do that, it helps us out a ton. That's one of the ways they get ratings and into that top 40 category for Apple Podcasts. So please subscribe if you would. Really appreciate it. All right. Also going to have some stickers that we are in the works of making right now. So going to have a sticker giveaway at some point. So check out, follow social media at Buffalo Roamer, and you can find out how to get some sweet Buffalo Roamer stickers. On to the show. Today, got a good one for you. Logan DeMarcus is the man on the mic across from me today. He comes to us from Alaska. I believe we were speaking, he was somewhere outside of Anchorage on this conversation. And he's a really interesting guy, a really badass, cool outdoorsman. He has been a guide on Denali, the largest, tallest mountain in North America. He's been a Denali guide for several seasons. He's a whitewater guide in Alaska, a backcountry ski guide as well. He's done some of that in Montana and worked in various capacities and spots, skiing and with adaptive skiing as well. He's also a veteran, served in the United States Marines. We didn't really touch on that at all, but I think it's noteworthy to toss in the intro here because it just rounds him out even that much more. So without further ado, here is Logan DeMarcus, episode number 6 of the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. Hey, Logan, what's going on, man?
Hey, brother. How you doing, Big Will?
Dude, we're doing great. I'm drinking a beer. I'm inside this makeshift podcast studio, which is super hot. I have moving blankets hung on the wall and talking to a good buddy about sweet adventures, dude. What could be better than that?
Yeah, not much, man. It's really nice to connect, given everything going on, and I appreciate to be a part of this and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, man, absolutely. So before we dive into it all, there's two main things I want to talk to you about, which is your time guiding on Denali, as well as your time guiding Whitewater up in Alaska. But those are just two little blurbs in a whole storied life of adventure for Logan DeMarcus. You and I met on the old ditch, the Grand Canyon. You were a trip leader for a trip that we were both on, and that's how we originally ran into each other. And let's start with that trip, man. That trip was awesome, huh?
Yeah, man, what a special thing after doing a handful of trips to put together that group of people and coming from a lot of different areas, as do most groups, I think, that go down the Grand Canyon. But I think it's hard from stories and years of stories that you hear to put together 16 folks that do really mesh well. And I wholeheartedly believe that was the case with our group. And it's fun, and often I like get triggered or brought back to those places where you want to share some stories. And again, I think a lot of folks that have been in those environments feel the same way, where you maybe are in a different group of friends, you want to share a story, but it doesn't land quite as much as it seemed to have when it was happening, or for those folks that were on the trip. But
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's hard to do those feelings for any trip like that. Those feelings, but especially the Grand Canyon, and that one specifically, is it's like it's a feeling that's deeper than you can explain. It's kind of like taking a photo of the moon on your phone. It's like you can't really appreciate the full depth of that moment. I mean, you can talk about it and you can share it, and especially with people who have shared the experience together, you can kind of connect on it deeper. But yeah, man, it was a pretty wild place and a pretty wild trip.
Yeah, for sure.
So give us a little rundown of the adventure life of Logan DeMarcus.
Yeah, so currently I have been working in guiding and or outdoor education pretty much year-round for the last 5 seasons. Most recently, a year in review for me looks like spending my winter months in Cook City, Montana, southern edge of Montana, where I work as a backcountry ski guide. Usually spend the springtime, early summertime back up in Alaska, which is home for me, and I work the Denali climbing season, which is a pretty short and sweet sprint type of a season as a climbing guide, and then bounce back and forth after that come mid-July. For the rest of the summer, I've done everything from come off the mountain and roll right into the Whitewater scene up here. More recently, I'm working for a couple programs, mainly First Descents and No Barriers, that work in the nonprofit outdoor education kind of health and wellness space for a few different populations. And that brings me a lot of different places within the country, which is beautiful. We get to do some adventuring, whether it be on boats or mountain bikes or rock climbing, ice climbing, kind of the whole gamut of spending time outdoors. And that I love making them places that can be accessible for most people. And then the fall times, I usually try to take a little time off. So that's, a good time for me to get in the Grand Canyon if I've got a trip, or do a little bit of traveling myself, or, just hunker down at home and give my body a rest after a kind of a crazy run. But right now I don't tend to find myself for any longer than about 3 to 4 months in any given place. And it's a fun rotation.
Heck yeah, man. Sounds like it. And you're about to head out post-Corona here or maybe even mid-Corona, I guess, do a little commercial salmon fishing, huh?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a interesting twist, as I'm sure it is for most folks. For me, and I think a lot of folks that I've seen in the outdoor industry, it's going to look like at least a temporary career change. It's interesting during this whole COVID thing. It has highlighted how how perceptions can be formed around what is essential and what's non-essential work. And
right.
Unfortunately, or understandably, not really unfortunately, but understandably, during a pandemic like this, anything that's increased risk taking or human to human contact, customer service oriented is or was on the chopping block first. So in the matter of about 48 to 72 hours come the third week of March, I lost about 6 or 7 months of work. So in conjunction with the different programs and different companies and different locations, had a schedule pretty wiped clean. And I really just consider myself fortunate that, having grown up in Alaska, you still have a lot of family ties, and was able to put in a couple phone calls, and wasn't too long before I had an offer to get on a boat and spend the summer commercial fishing. So it's, you change the hat and you keep on going.
Right on, man. So what's that season going to look like?
So I am stepping in or taking off the last couple days of May, and we will head down to Homer, Alaska. It's about 5 hours from Anchorage here, and spend, about a week or so getting the boat ready, loading gear, mending things, and just getting prepped for the ride itself. The boat I work on is called the Alaska Belle, and that is that fishes out of King Cove, Alaska. So that's about a 3 or 4 day boat ride from Homer just to get down, and that's way southwestern Alaska on the south side of the Aleutian Islands. And then the fishing season itself starts June 10th. So we're getting a little bit of an early start this year, just given the COVID stuff. So it'll give us about a 2-week window to quarantine as a crew, which, is kind of it's not kind of, it is a big precaution for us moving into the season. It's just trying to stay as healthy as possible. And so we'll have that 2 weeks to hunker down, get gear ready, and then hopefully be nets in the water right on or around June 10th when the season opens.
Sweet, man. It sounds like that'll be a sweet, long when you're in it, but short when you look back type of, adventure with a little money on the end. So nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah, hopefully it's a totally interesting change, right when you're getting to a place where you feel like you quite understand the variables involved in your work or the decisions you have to make. Life throws you a curveball. So for me, that's like, coming on 4 seasons into Denali and multiple seasons elsewhere, kind of felt like you're hitting that stride. And then it's that classic, like, life happens. And I joke, but I'm excited to go back to being the FNG, and it's going to be a completely different ball game for me, but I'm very excited. Yeah, I'm very excited.
Cool, man. Well, we'll have to catch up about that later, and once you're done, and see how it all went. But like I said, I want to get into a lot of stuff, but first, like, the overarching thing that just, like, screams out to me is Denali. It's like largest mountain, highest mountain in North America, like the mother of all mountains in our land. How many times have you summited Denali? Have you summited Denali? And give me, like, a breakdown experience of a Denali camp, or like a general, like, how things play out.
Yeah, so I'll I guess just get the easy questions out of the way. I have only climbed it 5 times, and I have stood on the summit once, and then turned around a number of other times in a number of different places, which is pretty common when you're in a working capacity or guiding capacity. Typically the success rate on that mountain is about 50%, but as a guide, you are spending your first season, 2-3 seasons in a more junior position. And so with that title kind of comes first on the chopping block if a client needs to be turned around, or, just you're kind of the first resource to be utilized if you need to watch or help or take care of someone else. And so it's a little bit shifted in terms of, like, quote unquote summit percentages, but I got my first summit last year as a second guide, and
Sick.
It was super exciting. And it's sorry if I feel a little all over the place here, but
no, you're good. It was a lot.
That's still processing, not returning, right? Like,
so you're supposed to go back there. I mean, in an ideal world without Corona, you'd be going back there nowish to guide again.
Yeah, I had another 2 trips on the books for this season, which is, like, a pretty good full season on Denali, and my first trip would have flown on today. So it's kind of a funny time to not be in mountaineering boots waiting on the tarmac in Talkeetna, but so be it.
Yeah, funny how this played out too, that we're talking about it on a day that you would have landed at base camp, huh?
Yeah, totally unexpectedly. And man, I often am drifting to this place of what I would kill to be on the mountain right now, and how peaceful it must be up there right now, and just how quiet. I was trying to do a little research and wasn't able to track back when the last time a climber wasn't on that mountain. So it just is a interesting year, and the mountain's taking a big rest, and it's not going anywhere. So
that's for sure.
Shift sights to next year and carry on.
Yeah. So what does a typical just say, for instance, for the company that you were guiding for with what does a typical Denali camp look like? And I don't necessarily mean like the base camp, but like how does the process work? Like how many days to acclimation and how many days to summit or how many base camps? What's a typical setup look like?
So we as a company, as a contractor, we run a 23-day contract, and within that contract is built around a 14-day summit plan with a bunch of extra contingency days or weather days. I can tell you now, with the exception of last June was the warmest and driest on record, with of which brought a bunch of very quick summits, which is very abnormal for that mountain. But our 14-day schedule allows for a pretty easy pace in terms of managing people acclimating at different rates, and just letting the body catch up. And that's kind of the name of the game on that mountain. It's easy to show up and run to a high altitude, and then you end up getting stopped anyways. So that 14-day summit schedule gives us a lot of time, and then having that week plus of contingency days as well gives us a lot of wiggle room, because as anyone that has spent any time in the Alaska Range knows, it's not really a matter of if but when you're going to get stuck in your tent. And usually that's not for 24 hours. Usually that's for anywhere from 4 to 7 days. So it's important to make moves on the mountain when it's clear, because you're most likely going to get stopped, and that's okay. You just factor that in. But I don't think I've spent any less than 19 days on the mountain in any of my 5 trips.
And how tall is Denali?
Denali is 20,310 feet.
20,310 feet.
Yeah, recently dropped 10 feet. It was for years 20,320 feet, and then they did a new geological survey that dropped that 10 feet. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So how about like those storms when you're climbing and you hit a storm? What is that like? And I mean, I can only imagine, especially, I mean, if you're a paying client, obviously you got to be pretty badass still to climb and go take a stab at Denali, but to be stuck in your tent for like 4 to 6 days in some gnarly storm on the side of a mountain, like that sounds wild. What are those storms like?
When you're in the moment, hopefully you're not caught by surprise. I guess I'll preface that with this. So hopefully those storms have not caught you by surprise, which immediately makes your life hopefully quite comfortable. I think I've seen people struggle the hardest, more so than any physical work or anything they've done. Both guides and clients, private climbers, everything in between, kind of struggle with the mental game that comes with waiting out a storm. And for some folks, that's just having the control stripped from them, where you're like making moves and you're crushing the trail and you're feeling healthy, and then you're just stopped in your place. Really can instill some sense of loss of control to others who are, counting minutes in the schedule that are remaining, whether that be days or what have you, to try to crunch the numbers to make sure that there's still an opportunity to continue moving up the mountain. But I think I personally really try to train clients and talk frequently amongst guide teams around just, you're really almost looking forward to those times where you do get stuck in the weather. It gives often us a chance to fix gear. It gives people great rest, much needed rest. It sets the stage for kind of the mindset moving higher and higher on the mountain, where the higher up the mountain we go, you have less and less of an opportunity to work with the weather or amongst the weather to make it happen. So you're really working with the weather and the conditions that are given to you, and not really trying to just put your head down and wrench your way through.
Yeah, it's usually how you get into trouble in the big mountains, huh? Or on anything.
Yeah, man. I think, like Denali is a place that is a culmination of like millions of micro goals and micro decisions. And that's really hard to make tangible for folks when you're just touching down on the airstrip and, like you're not even really sniffing at camp 1 from base camp. You got to get tents erected, and there's just it's a place that really highlights the importance of keeping those small problems small and the small decisions small. And then that mixed with a little bit of luck and some good timing. And, before you know it, you're like, oh, look, the summit. But, it beats into you. That mountain naturally beats into people the importance of just taking it step by step.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it, right?
Yeah. And I don't think that's anything groundbreaking in the outdoor space. That applies to a lot of different venues and mountains everywhere and rivers everywhere. But
applies to everything, man. The only way to get started is to put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, exactly. It's just quite a dramatic enforcer up there.
Yeah, seriously. How many camps are there for a Denali summit with Logan DeMarcus?
So we typically split, and there are 5 main used camps. So you have base camp at 7,200 feet. That's where you fly a plane in straight from Talkeetna. And that sits on the south side of the summit proper and is virtually right on the border of the national park. So that's where planes are cut off. So you touch down, land at base camp. You'll make a trip to camp 1, which is at 7,800 feet. So you only gain 600 feet, but it's about a 5.5-mile walk. And the heaviest of the bunch, because you're single carrying everything. You've got all your weight, all your food, fuel, gear.
Yeah.
It can be a crushing leg of the trip for folks. Camp 2 sits at about 11,200 feet. Camp 3 sits at about 14,200 feet. And Camp 4, high camp, sits at about 17,200 feet. So the best place to be, in my opinion, is to get to Camp 3, that one at 14,200 feet. Because at that point, you're just waiting and watching for weather and a time window to make a summit push. So,
right.
Yeah, a lot of the work is done on the lower mountain, but it's really game on once you get to 14,000 feet.
What is, if you had like one overarching memory that pops into your head from 5 seasons guiding Denali or 5 attempts, what's that like one overarching story or memory that comes through?
I would say 2 years ago, I turned around with a trip about 150 feet from the summit. So I kind of joke like a hefty Nerf football throw away, and we would have been standing there. But just conditions were not working out, and I had a very visceral moment with the rest of the guide team and the climbers themselves about just like, we do not belong here. And so, it's some ways bounce back and forth for that being a very stark moment of disappointment, but also in that same breath being the easiest decision I've ever made on that mountain. What
was the scenario that caused you to turn back 150 yards shy of the top?
So, with the conditions you get in the mountains, you can get, you get cold, you get wind, and you get snow. And very loosely speaking, you can manage, or it's easier to manage when one of those things are happening, right? Like you can kind of manage some cold temperatures so long as it's not super windy or snowing,
right.
And change that variable around as you wish. But we loosely say you can manage one of those. And starting that morning, we had multiple working against us in that it was cold and we could observe some wind, but right on that line, or we had a really strong team and motivated team, and we were running out of time. So it was a chance to at least try, right? If even you can always turn around, and just making that decision to turn around at a safe spot is important. But so we went on a try and made it most of the route on summit day. So we left high camp at 17,200 feet. Not until about 9:30 in the morning. You want a little bit of sun in your favor because it can be blistering cold. And got up the Autobahn, hit Denali Pass, skirted above Zebra Rocks, past Archdeacons, and across the football field. And we were climbing Pig Hill, which is the last big objective on your way to the summit. And along the route that day, we had different periods of increased wind and cold, and we kind of hunkered in place here and there, and but still felt like we were, giving a good effort and pretty in control of, or pretty understanding of where people were at individually on the rope. And we crossed the football field and started ascending Pig Hill. And I remember thinking, like stepping and thinking, oh yeah, man, we totally got this. We're near the top. People are healthy. Like I said, we had a pretty strong team. So we had left high camp first that day. So we were kind of leading the charge for a handful of other teams that were going for a summit bit as well. And
Nice.
Just moving well and stoked. And yeah, everything was lining up. And you top out of Pig Hill and you bear left about 90 degrees, and you kind of expose yourself onto the summit ridge of the route, which is
the home stretch.
You're the home stretch. It's nothing super technical. It's just very aesthetic. I mean, it's a picturesque image itself. And then on Summit Ridge, I mean, you're on your way to the summit, and you've got some of the best views that Alaska has to offer. And it's really a nice break from the route itself as you approach the summit to like take a second, look around and whatnot. But anyways, we got to the top of Big Hill and made that turn, and the wind was just whipping. It was blowing across the summit ridge at about 50 to 55 miles an hour. And it's not a place you want to be where you don't feel like you have control of your footing or the rope or what have you. And like I said, so at that point we had 3 guides and 5 climbers, and the 3 of us guides circled up, and it was about a half a second decision to look at one another, and you kind of understood that it wasn't going to go. And, to turn around to the rope team, which is kind of funny. It had a bunch of Navy SEALs and a couple of just young climbing partners that had climbed a lot together, like just a stout team. And we went to them to kind of break the bad news, and the Navy SEALs, were like, man, we were hoping you weren't about to tell us we were going to go try to do that. So
they knew
it. Yeah, it's like, again, like I said, it was the most upsetting moment, one of the more upsetting moments I've had on the mountain, but one of the easiest decisions ever made.
How about any not pranks, but any like goofy stories of either like clients or guides pulling somebody's leg, or like just like a funny story or moment from base camp or something that comes to mind?
Yeah, like I dare get too specific because I don't want
to incriminate anyone.
No. I just don't want the bad juju to come back my way, because I think we're all between hard days in the mountains. And one of the things that brings humor, I think, to a whole rope team is guide or client, whatever your position or title or expertise is, like everyone has hard days on that mountain, and how that manifests is always pretty interesting. And,
right.
You couple that with altitude that has funky effects on people. And, you see people act in interesting ways. Like I kind of joke that the mountains have a way to default people to being children. And
right.
I don't mean that like wrongly. You just,
totally.
With altitude, you can have your judgment impaired. And then with, being physically or mentally exhausted, often stirs or sparks some pretty funny conversations or just barks at one another. And that's the majority of, I think, our job as guides is to manage people's well-being throughout the course of 3 weeks.
Totally.
Like they show up either physically fit or not, but it's kind of up to us to, you run around and put out those little fires or make sure people are getting along, or,
yep.
They don't hate their tent partner, or, yeah, so it's a place that often you just before you realize that you've spent 6 days in a tent with the same people, and you're like, dude, I got to get away. I need to go for a walk or what have you. And it's never without entertainment on the mountain, that's for sure.
How about your whitewater guiding experience? I know you worked for one company in Alaska for a number of seasons, right?
Yeah, I worked for a company called Nova Alaska, which boats a handful of places around South Central Alaska, and um, likewise, I think most river guides probably have the same story, regardless of what river they're on. But a little bit of a different thing up here, as I'm sure you can attest to from your Yukon days, is I joke that on our multi-day trips, I would strap 45 caliber pistol to my raft frame, and it wasn't always for the bears. So yeah, I've had a series of pretty just classic Alaskan type run-ins with folks in the backwoods
I
along
thought
some
you were
of these
talking about
rivers.
clients.
No, never. More for the prospectors,
Yeah, I know what you
these
mean.
crusty Alaskans are hard to work with sometimes.
What's any funny, like I always think of Whitewater, and especially like Whitewater guiding, because Whitewater is such an odd thing, and whitewater rafting I think is such an odd thing because it's such this like powerful, dangerous, intense moment, and you have to have your wits about you, especially if you're on the oars or like in charge of the movement of whatever type vessel you're taking in whitewater. Like, water doesn't stop, it's powerful, and yet we just like get these big inflatable things and like pile in a bunch of yahoos into it and have one person in the back with like a little plastic oar, like, let's go. It's just like it's a funny I don't know the word. It's a funny complexity of like the guide in the back being the one person controlling the boat, and he's or she is really the only person on that boat that understands the dangers of everything going on.
Yeah, totally. And I think that goes in a multitude of directions, but some would argue like, yeah, it is your job to be the one that understands those risks and somehow provides a delivery of where like you can keep people clueless. Or not clueless, but just like keeping it purely in the fun zone.
Right.
Or others, and it definitely depends on the caliber of water, or the class of water you're on. Where you get in the class 4 and class 5 whitewater, there's a much different relationship with your paddlers. And I think it's fun to really tell people like, I might have a little bit more training than you guys all, but like, we're in this together now.
Right. Yeah, seriously.
We're going. And, I think people love, you said it, like water doesn't stop. And there's that piece when you can keep it in the fun zone that is very challenging for folks and really eye-opening, because you do lose control at times, and it's a little bit of a dance with what you're doing with your craft, whether it be kayak or raft, as it moves through the water. And that changes with how much weight you have in the boat, or what the flow is looking like, or even if you're having an on or off day. It's a pretty unique experience, and I'm really thankful to have been able to do it up here for years. Just that, there's not a lot of people doing it. So oftentimes if you meet or talk to someone that's boated in the state of Alaska, it's been at the hands of, one of us or someone that's also works on some of the handful of rivers, the few rivers that are commercially rafted up here.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of the same thing I found with this podcast. This is like reaching out and talking to people about cool shit, and like cool stuff just leads to more cool people and cool stuff,
Yeah, man. It's a beautiful place to be if you like that. It's very different up here to be on the water, in that it's all free flowing. So that mixed with glacier runoff, snow runoff, and the increased light we get every time you put your boat on the water, it's a different flow. And as a boater, especially a commercial guide, where you get very used to running the same stretches, it's extremely engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. How about any whitewater stories that come to mind of either like flipped raft or I always think, kind of like how I started the conversation, like I just think it's such a funny juxtaposition of if I said that right, of client to guide, because I just like see some tourists like sitting in the boat like all smiles, and then they get in the water and it's just like their eyes are like 10 miles wide, and they're like can barely move, and they're like, holy shit, like this raft bum who was like sleeping in the tent in the parking lot last night, like when I walked up with my, whatever it is, designer sunglasses and lawyer car, and just showed up, like I was way above them. And then we get on the water in the middle of like a class 3, class 4 rapid, and it's like the guy in the back of the boat's the king,
Yeah, you experience all sorts of different conversations and like kind of like tests of power dynamics. And I hate to generalize, but if I had to pick one foul swoop of a demographic, it would be like the 40 to 55-year-old dad, that you're like,
right,
dude, I'm not doing anything other than just trying to ask you to paddle. I'm not, so we all stay dry. Like that's so we just all stay upright. And I think one of the things I love about one of the rivers we boat up on here called 6 Mile Creek, which is a beautiful run of Class 5 whitewater, is unique to boating in Alaska to begin with. Everyone's wearing a dry suit, so all guides and clients wear a dry suit virtually every run, and that's pretty different for most folks. A lot of folks,
totally,
maybe even with whitewater experience, haven't first upon meeting their guides been shoved a dry suit.
Dude, I wish on a handful of the commercial whitewater trips I've been on, I wish I had a dry suit, dude. I remember running like some May Clear Creek, Colorado runs with a buddy who was a guy, just being like so cold, just drenched in 40-degree water, and it's like 50 degrees outside.
Yeah, no, they're pretty sweet, man. I'm a total softie when it comes to dry suit. It's like, I think if you got one that has minimal or no leaking, it makes you feel invincible in cold water. But anyways, at the put-in for that 6 Mile Creek, we got everyone geared up. They do the safety speech, and immediately the clients jump in the water. And the guides have already taken the boats down to an eddy, I don't know, a couple hundred meters down the river, and the guests have to swim to their boats. And it's really to help bridge that gap of understanding that some folks show up with. It's like, oh, I just have to get in and my guide does everything, where you're boating in a little bit more intense water. And it looks like, we truly do need all participation. And
right.
if you're not comfortable swimming or being in the water, then it might not be the trip, to take right now, or maybe you try something else first. And without any negotiation either way, or without any persuasion either way, that simple act tends to cause people a lot of struggle, which is kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, no, I could totally see it. It's like throwing them in, throwing them in the frying pan. It's like, this is what happens. This is real. This is not a roller coaster.
And it's like, it's not from a place of being mean or trying to bully anyone.
It's reality.
It's like, how do you, in a sport that has just as serious a risks, like how do you clue people in without scaring them? If we're scaring people off the water, we're not doing our job well.
Totally.
So how do you just prepare people to be like, hey, it kind of the nature of Class 5 being Class 5 is a degree of unpredictability. So yes, we're going to give our best shot, but who knows?
Yeah, right. I know it. It's fun. What was your first trip down the Grand Canyon?
I got an opportunity back in 2016 to row a baggage boat for a company called Oars, and a lead guy down there named Ashley Brown, who is just a crusher, works the Middle Fork of the salmon season for the bulk of the summer, has been a long-term guide, and is a dorywoman down in the Grand Canyon, and then spends her winters in Crested Butte, Colorado. Where she has worked for the local guide service there. She's worked for the mountain in a ski patrol capacity, just all around great mountain person. And I was really honored to do my first trip down there. It was a little bit of an interesting twist. I had been boating for a while and had done other multi-days in a guiding capacity, but to have my personal first Grand Canyon trip be a working trip, it was a sprint. Yeah, it was a total sprint.
What do you remember from that first Grand Canyon trip? Because it was the second one when you and I went together, right?
Third.
Okay, third. So
Yeah,
what do you remember from that first Grand Canyon trip? Because I have such visceral memories of just the feeling of being in that place, like the feeling of the history of all the people who had boated there before, and like all of the water that has surged through that canyon over hundreds of years. Like, I feel like I can remember the feeling of feeling that history in the walls, you know?
Yeah, and it was twofolded, you know. In one hand, physically, I was like, holy crap, I've never boated a boat this big. Yeah, I was in an 18-foot expedition frame that was like, as a baggage boater, fully weighted, and especially up here, we're used to rocking pretty cut down, lightweight, like 12-foot boats. So physically, you're like, holy crap, this
Right,
is
moving some weight.
Way different game. And then, you know, I remember having a lot of periods of time thinking like, I really wish I wasn't working right now, because you're in one of the most beautiful places in the world, and to want to just hang out there longer was a feeling I resembled through a lot of that trip. But you know, in opposition to that, I had the luxury of doing it with some very experienced Grand Canyon guides. So you're also like, I found myself just wanting to sponge. You sponge. And that's everything from the logistics of how to make the trip happen and how to tie down the things on the boat and do all the things, to just listening and, you know, hearing the, kind of the lore of the canyon and the immense geological knowledge that people bring, and the fluff that some people bring, the creative storytelling aspect of it. It's a hard place to leave.
Yeah, it's a pretty magical place, man. It's I need to get back down there for round 2 for me. It's like, yeah, it was unique for me because I was just coming off of my Yukon trip where it was just me and one other person for 70 days, and coming off that into like 16 people, it's a big difference. And it was just like, it was awesome. It was just the most awesome group wilderness experience that I can imagine. I tell everybody, like, if you get a chance to go down the Grand Canyon, don't be stupid. Like, make it happen, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you, man. And that makes it, you know, after working a couple trips and then getting to do a private trip, and then on top of that having just feeling nothing but gratitude for the roster that Rob put together for that one was such a cool progression in the time that I've gotten to spend down there.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you have a favorite rapid in the Grand Canyon? Favorite set?
Man, I'm a big fan of Hance. So earlier on in the trip, it's, I think, often an overlooked or undervalued one. It's not the cleanest in terms of being able to center gut it and smash all the waves and everything. You know, there's a nice technical piece to it. And as a boater, not very many rivers or rapids not require, but not very many of those situations do boaters choose to enter it backwards with a downstream ferry angle.
Right.
Not to get too jargony there,
right.
But that is, the kind of the move to do, especially with a big heavy boat. And so that's unique in that. And then it's just there's a lot that can go on in that. And I think, just to place that, I think from our trip, I have a visceral moment of, I believe I was like the last boat, or I think I was running sweep, and I was backwards oriented, like got my angle set now and everything. And I looked up at the scout spot for that rapid, and there was another group. There was a group behind us. And I remember saying, "He's already swimming." And they were pointing at our buddy Alex, who had taken that rapid on in a ducky, and the first little wave knocked him over. He swam that whole thing. That's not, I think, I never have, knock on wood, and I don't really want to, and I don't think most people that have experienced that would want to do it again. And I do think that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, man. I was actually just telling this story this weekend to another friend of mine who also has done the podcast. His name is Matt. He's a international fly fishing guide. He works in the Seychelles. But I was fishing with him the other day, and he's gone down the Grand a few times. And we were talking about it, and I was telling him this story as well, how our friend Alex took on Hance in a ducky, hits broadside on like the smallest first little, I don't even think you could call it a hole, like the smallest first little riffle before the actual rapid starts, hits it broadside, eats it, and swims the whole thing. And I specifically remember, like, I was the boat right in front of him. And I remember I told this to Matt the other day too. I was saying that Alex is like the guy who was like, you know, you could see it coming that he might eat it, he might swim, but he would still be pumped about it. And so he's paddling in, broadsides the first little wave, eats it, is in the water. I'm in the bow of my boat, and I like see him, you know, floating down to me. I'm yelling at him like, "Hey, eyes!" I got eyes on him. I'm like, "I got eyes!" Like keeping my finger pointed to where he's at. He comes to me. I yell out his name. You know, his eyes are like, you know, the size of, I don't even know, those googly eyes. Like he's gasping as the cold water, like he's able to haul in air between, you know, mouthful of water. I throw him the throw rope off the front of the boat, and I throw it to him downstream, like, you know, like half a foot downstream. He misses the rope. Eventually, I'm yelling at him to swim towards us. He swims towards us, and I like haul him up and get him in the boat. And I just remember thinking, like, what the fuck, dude? Like, holy shit, that was crazy. And he just looks at me and he's like, "That was fucking awesome." I'm like, "No, dude, that was not awesome." But looking back on it, it's funny because that's just the type of guy he was. Like, anybody who's gonna hit the first real big set in a ducky without a ton of experience is that type of person anyway. And he was stoked about it, you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean this in all hilarity, but that moment of like underskilled and overconfident. But yeah, there's no better person to pick up a ducky or inflatable kayak paddle than someone like that.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I remember about Alex from the Grand Canyon, and not to dive too far into our trip specifics, but I think they're funny stories, is we were there on the experimental, I suppose it'd be experimental, but dam release. So the water was flowing. Do you remember what the CFSs were and how high it rose? It went from like 8 CFS to 30,000, right?
Yeah, our flows were, we started the trip, I think, flowing between 7 and 10,000 CFS, which is considered relatively low. It's the fall time. Vegas isn't requiring a ton of energy, so it is managed on the low end of that. And yeah, they did about every other year they do a high flow experiment, and we were on the water for that. And it's kind of cool because they don't really announce it until pretty shortly before it happens. So it's not something you can either plan around or book or anything, but we happened to be right in the thick of it. And it rose to, I think it ended up peaking at 38,100 CFS.
Yeah, that's a big change when you're in a canyon that, you know, is pretty much straight up on either side. And so to tie the story, and I remember the night where we expected the water to rise, we expected it to rise through the night because we're, you know, I don't know how far we were, maybe 50, 100 miles downriver from where the dam was at. So we expected it to take some time. We knew when the dam was releasing. We expected it to take some time for the water to rise where we were at. We were expecting it to rise that night, and we were all making bets where we thought how high on the canyon wall the water would rise to. We had set up camp, climbed like a mountain goat up a small path, and set up camp in a high little valley. And I remember Alex was sleeping in his ducky. He had his ducky placed on a cliff probably 30 feet, 25, 30 feet above where we were unloading our boats. So 30 feet above water line. He had his ducky there, and he was sleeping in his ducky. He was using it as a thermarest, and we expected the water to come that night. Thank God the water didn't come overnight, because the next morning when we all sat around and watched the water gush through the canyon, the spot that Alex was sleeping in an inflatable kayak was completely underwater. He would have been washed, downriver in the middle of the night if it had actually happened the way we thought it might.
Yeah, man, to be on a fly on the wall for that to have happened would have been pretty funny. I'm not even convinced he would have woken up right when the water took him.
Oh, funny times. So What stories from your Grand Canyon trips, stick out? Is there one? I know I'm kind of asking the same thing over and over about each specific thing, but do you have a memory of the Grand Canyon over your 3 trips that sticks out more than others?
I think it's a collective thing. I would say it's like not a specific like, oh, this one time, but I think the collective turning point that I've watched people experience and I've experienced myself in a place like that, whether they be clients or friends, like on our trip, is that moment where I don't want to say like the moment when people get it, because that alludes to some like witchcraft or something going on, but just kind of that moment where they either like finally let go of the last thing that they felt like they needed to keep in their control, to a place of beauty, kind of that moment of awe that really I think settles people into the place. And I, at least in the few 3 trips that I've done, I've been able to watch every person have that, and it doesn't matter if that is the guide that has 60 trips on the river, or the person that has been saving for the last 10 years to make this trip happen. And it's often it's often not at a place where people expect it. It's often something that you can just almost sense in their aura or around the campfire that night, that they're like, wow, that like they had a moment.
Yeah. Okay. If there's outdoor folks listening who have never done the Grand Canyon but would want to, what are the 5 rules, or not 5 rules, but what are a handful of rules for the Grand Canyon, just to keep in mind? Not like just general canyon thoughts for someone never having gone down before.
I think it's good to have a plan, but don't fall in love with it. I think that's good, outdoor knowledge 101. But the Grand Canyon is a really easy place, I feel like, to just slip it in gear and then feel like you can just put it on cruise control. But like we talked about earlier, I think it's a place where small accurate decisions really help the flow of the trip. So whether that's like being married to camping at a specific spot, it's kind of a free-for-all with camps. So just be willing to change what you think it's going to look like.
Sure.
2, I think if you're on a private trip with friends and you're running a boat, I always joke, like, try to be the person that tries to take the most stuff in your boat. That'll go just a long way when you're, like, there's always going to be way more stuff than you had planned on there being. And
right,
kind of reach this awkward moment at rig day where folks are trying to like shell each other different stuff and get rid of stuff and lighten their loads. But just take it in stride and throw it on your boat, find a strap for it, and things are going to get repositioned around regardless.
Yeah.
I think functionally a pretty important one is don't pee in the groover. I feel like that's like that's river talk 101. Any river, any trip, anywhere, just don't be the guy to like, or gal to pee in the groover.
Bathroom etiquette is different than front country life on the Grand Canyon for sure, huh?
Yeah, totally. 4 is I think, especially in the Grand Canyon, more so than mountaineering or anything else, like, don't be afraid to pack things that are going to make your life comfortable.
Sure.
It's not a place where you need to go quote unquote rough it for 3 weeks.
Right.
Like, you definitely can bring some creature comforts that make a huge difference, that again, that they make it not feel like 3 weeks long.
Yep.
5 would be, I think, recognizing that I think this is just something that for a lot of folks, especially if you haven't done a trip like that, you've probably never really been exposed to the setting, but you're creating a micro community for 3 weeks. And, bring with that the understanding that maybe your communication style is going to have to change, or like, giving up control, or just being kind
a
of
team
one
member.
One for the masses, because the thing, like, things can change so quickly down there. And just as an example, right, like flipping a boat and losing a bunch of gear, and so you shouldn't be wanting to piss off anyone anyways, but it's just such a microcosm of an established community for a finite amount of time that stresses folks in kind of a hyper way. So regardless of those stressors, realizing that everyone's going to have hard days on the river and stoked days, and it's okay to feel differently than other people, but just like, know when appropriate times are for you to party down or go with the flow, and know when you need to take your own space and go for a hike.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, man, dude, I had a lot of fun talking with you. I think we're going to wrap her up here. But before I let you go, what you been reading anything or watching any YouTube videos or movies that have you stoked on life in general, or like specifically adventure or outdoors, or you've been watching or consuming anything that's piqued your interest that you'd recommend to someone?
Yeah, totally. I recently just finished a book given to me by the neighbors that we met at Emma's place in Colorado, a really nice Norwegian family. Anyways, he gifted me this book called Land of the White Death, and it sounds super intense, but it is based in the early 1900s during the kind of the race for polar exploration.
Sweet.
And it's just a wild story about a ill-equipped captain who floats his boat, intentionally gets it stuck in the sea ice, trying to float, or trying to go through the Northeast Passage. They end up locked in the ice for like 2 years. And then there's mutiny on the boat. Half the crew decides to leave and try to traverse the ice pack back to the northern land masses of Norway in that area. And it expedition wise, it's crazy. Storytelling, it's crazy. It's a really good read. And what makes it unique is that a lot of the writing that's been done in polar exploration has been done from like a historian lens, people inferring things or like connecting dots. And this is a translation of the navigator who ends up leading the party that splits from the ship and heads towards land. It's his journal. It's his diary of like day to day. And
Sweet.
It's just super motivating. It's an easy read, but it really makes you feel like, holy crap. What a wild time. Like before people had been to people didn't know what the northernmost latitude was. People were like sick, made it to the next rung up the ladder. And
right.
It really just motivates the inner adventurer in me. And then I also, kind of in a silly lens, I've been reading a lot of philosophy. And as these times are uncertain and changing a lot for me, I have been reading a lot and trying to understand a little bit more of kind of the school of Stoicism from ancient philosophers. And I've taken a lot from that while I've been sitting idle-handed, having gone from being in the mountains for 14, 16 hours a day and just every day of the week to being landlocked and then told not to get outside on trails and skis and not to take risks, flip me upside down. So it's an opportunity to learn a little something, and it's helped me redefine how I've been using the word adventure, right? And I've been kind of joking that, well, it doesn't look like stepping onto a plane to fly into the Alaska range right now. I've been like kind of adventuring in the kitchen, and I've been adventuring in my local neighborhood, and doing things that I typically don't have the time to do or have not made a priority in the time I have to do. And that's been it's been the silver lining of this.
Cool, man. Yeah, absolutely. Adventure is what you make it. If you're trying for something new and different, and whatever scale that's on, you're making it an adventure, right?
Yeah, I think you got to recalibrate, right? I think we can get pretty used to what our environment looks like, and it takes a little bit of work. But man, I'll tell you what, I've never thought I would find so much enjoyment into YouTube searching what is wrong with my sourdough starter as I have.
All right, man. Well, so you're heading out to the salmon boat, do a little fishing for the summer season up in Alaska. I know Corona's kind of throwing things up in the air, but any plans after that, or any trips kicking around in the back of your brain that might not be super likely but could possibly be getting the wheels rolling?
Yeah, so it's on a touch and go, but closest to home up here, my old man retired recently, and he is who raised me on boats all over Alaska and is still a pretty avid outdoorsman in his 70s. And so we, for a couple of years been talking about getting a trip together up in the Brooks Range, and are hoping to crawl towards making that happen, whether that's this year or just, nailing things down for next year, making a longer trip. And then, alternatively, I think depending on what happens after this, looking at landing somewhere a little more long term, and that could look like buying down in Montana or buying a home up here in Alaska, and that's pretty exciting to think about as well. And then also, like we talked on earlier, man, to hear Matt talk about Antarctica with such affection, it sounds like there's some cool opportunities and shorter contracts to do a little bit of blasting work down there, which I think would just be an interesting intersection of the skills I took from the military to working in an Arctic environment, working in ice and snow again. So we'll see.
Dude, thanks for hopping on the show. Hope all goes well, and best of luck on the boat this season. And glad to catch up, man. And hopefully we'll do it again sometime soon. And there you have it, another episode of the Buffalo Roamer podcast officially in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget, subscribe. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, online at buffaloroamer.com. Wherever you listen to the podcast, please subscribe. Helps us out tremendously. Also going to have some stickers coming in, so if you want to get hooked up with some stickers, we're going to be doing a giveaway. If you share the podcast, you can get hooked up with some stickers, so check back for that. And also, of course, have a ton more awesome guests lined up. I've spoken with some really cool, awesome, interesting, badass, if I may say, folks. So look for those, because those are going to be a lot of fun, a lot more adventures to be had here on the Buffalo Roamer podcast.